It was April 17th, 2009, just after sunrise, when Daniel Reeves pulled his rusted pickup truck into the gravel lot of the Greene County Farm Auction in Iowa. A thin mist still clung to the ground, rolling low over fields that had once fed entire families, fields now abandoned after the financial collapse of 2008. Behind Daniel's truck rattled a trailer, carrying something most men there wouldn't even bother to look at, twice a narrow, dented, oil-stained tractor that looked older than the barn beside it. Men in pressed denim jackets and polished boots stood in small circles sipping coffee, their voices low but confident. They were landowners, investors, equipment dealers, men who spoke in acreage and yield, who measured worth in tons and contracts. And then there was Daniel, a mailman. Someone noticed him first. "Hey!" A voice called out loud enough to cut through the murmurs. "You lost, buddy." A few heads turned. Then more. Daniel stepped down from his truck without answering. He adjusted his cap, glanced once at the auction board, and began walking toward the registration table as if he had every right to be there. That was when the laughter started. "Wait a second," another man said, squinting. "That's Reeves, the mailman. He delivers up on County Road 12. Mailman, someone chuckled. "What's he doing at a farm auction?" Daniel kept walking. And then a deeper voice rose above the rest, smooth, confident, and just loud enough to command attention. Richard Hale. Everyone in Greene County knew that name. Richard stepped forward, adjusting the cuff of his expensive watch, his boots untouched but dust. He owned more land than anyone for 30 miles. If there was a deal to be made, Richard made it first, and usually made it last. "Well now," Richard said with a thin smile. "Didn't expect to see the postman trying to become a farmer overnight." The crowd leaned in. Daniel stopped at this table, signed his name quietly, and took his bidder number. He didn't look at Richard. Not yet. But Richard wasn't done. You know, he continued, turning slightly, so more people could hear. "Farming isn't something you pick up between delivering letters and magazines." A few men laughed. Daniel finally turned. Not angry, not defensive, just steady. "I'm just here to buy a piece of land," he said. That only made it worse. A piece of land. One of the dealers scoffed. "You don't even have a real tractor." All eyes drifted to the old machine on Daniel's trailer. The paint had peeled decades ago. The metal bore scars of repairs done not in shops, but in barns. It looked tired. "Thing belongs in a museum," someone muttered. Richard chuckled softly. Even a museum might pass on it. More laughter. Daniel didn't respond. And that silence, the way he stood there without defending himself, somehow made the moment sharper. Because humiliation doesn't always come from what is said. Sometimes it comes from what everyone believes. The auction began shortly after. Plots of land were called out one by one. Good soil, irrigated acres, prime farmland. Richard raised his hand, often casually buying what he wanted without hesitation. Others followed, but no one outbid him for long. Daniel said nothing. Not until Lot 17. Lot 17, the auctioneer announced. 20 acres. Former Reeves property. Abandoned since '98. Soil reports indicate high salinity. No active irrigation. Starting bid. A few men shook their heads before the number was even finished. "That land's dead," someone whispered. "Nothing grows there. Waste of money." Daniel lifted his hand. The auctioneer blinked. "Bidder 42. A ripple moved through the crowd. Richard turned slowly. "You've got to be kidding," he said, almost himself. Daniel didn't lower his hand. One older farmer called out not unkindly that land'll eat your money and give you nothing back. Another voice added louder this time. Even weeds gave up on that field. The laughter came again, but this time it lingered. Richard stepped closer just enough to be heard, without raising his voice. "You don't know what you're buying," he said. Daniel met his eyes, and for the first time something passed between them that wasn't just mockery. It was certainty, on both sides. "I know enough," Daniel replied. Richard smiled, but there was a faint edge to it now. "Then go ahead," he said. "Let's see how far a mailman's instincts take him." No one else bid. The hammer came down. Sold. And just like that, Daniel Reeves became the owner of the worst piece of land in Greene County. But there was something no one there understood. Not Richard. Not the dealers. Not the men who had farmed their whole lives. Because this story wasn't really about a bad piece of land. And it definitely wasn't about that old tractor. To understand why Daniel raised his hand that morning, you have to go back much further. Back to a smaller house on the edge of that same dead field. Back to a boy who learned early that silence could hold more knowledge than noise. Daniel Reeves was 12 the first time he saw his father cry over soil. It was late summer, 1994. The sun had burned the fields white, and the ground cracked underfoot like broken pottery. His father, Thomas Reeves, stood in the middle of their land, holding a handful of dirt that looked more like ash than earth. "Salt's rising again," he muttered. Daniel didn't fully understand what that meant. Not then, but he understood the weight in his father's voice. Thomas Reeves wasn't a big man, but he carried himself like someone who had made peace with hard things. He believed in work, in patience, in listening to the land. "Land talks," he used to say. Just not in words most folks bother to hear. While other farmers expanded, borrowed, upgraded, Thomas stayed small, careful, observant, and then the yields started dropping. Year after year, neighbors switched crops, installed new systems, took loans for modern equipment. Thomas tried something different. He started digging, not for water, not for roots, for answers. He would take Daniel out into the field before sunrise, carrying a shovel and a worn notebook. They dug narrow trenches, studying the layers of soil like pages in a book. "There's still life down there," Thomas would say. "Buried. Trapped. But why can't it reach the top?" Daniel asked once. Thomas paused. Then he tapped the ground with the shovel, because something's stopping it. That something became an obsession. At night, Thomas filled his notebook with diagrams, measurements, strange calculations. He modified his old tractor again and again, adjusting the plow depth, shifting weight, changing angles no one else bothered to think about. People started talking. "Reeves is digging himself into debt, chasing ghosts in the dirt. Man's lost his sense." Daniel heard it all, and so did his father. But Thomas never argued. He just kept working, until the year everything broke. The crops failed completely. The bank came. The land was taken. And the man who had spent years trying to understand the soil stood at the edge of it one last time, silent. That night, Daniel found the notebook on the kitchen table. His father didn't say much. He rarely did, but before Daniel went to bed, Thomas placed a hand on the cover. "There's something here," he said quietly. "I just ran out of time to prove it." Daniel didn't answer. He just nodded, because even at 12 years old, he believed him, and that belief stayed. Through years of delivering mail across other people's successful farms, through winters and summers, watching crops rise and fall, through every quiet evening spent reading that notebook under a dim light, Daniel never forgot what his father saw in that soil. And more importantly, he never forgot what everyone else failed to see, because buried in those pages was an idea no one had ever taken seriously. And one day, he was going to prove it. The first time Daniel Reeves set foot on that land after the auction, the wind carried a faint, bitter smell, like metal left too long in the rain. It was late April, and the rest of Greene County was already waking up to the season. Fields were being turned to seeds, ordered irrigation lines checked. But here, nothing moved. The ground stretched out pale and uneven, streaked with white veins, where salt had pushed its way to the surface. It didn't look like farmland. It looked like something abandoned on purpose. Daniel stood there for a long moment, hands in his pockets, boots sinking slightly into the brittle crust. He didn't rush. He didn't speak. He just looked, because he had seen this before. Not exactly this field, but something like it. Years ago, back when his father still believed the land could be brought back. He walked slowly across the acreage, stopping every few yards to kneel to touch the soil, to break it apart in his hands. The texture mattered. The weight mattered. Even the smell mattered. Most men would have seen failure. Daniel saw a pattern, but even he didn't move right away, because this part of the story wasn't about proving anyone wrong. Not yet. It was about listening, and what he noticed standing there in the quiet was something small, easy to miss. Something no one at that auction had cared to check. The soil wasn't dead all the way through. Only the top layer was. He stood up slowly, and for the first time since that morning at the auction, he allowed himself the faintest hint of a smile, because if the top was the problem, then maybe the answer wasn't to add something new. Maybe it was to uncover something old. But that idea came with a cost, because no machine in Greene County was built to do what Daniel was about to try. Not modern ones. Not efficient ones. Not the kind Richard Hale had lined up in perfect rows on his land. Daniel drove home that evening without saying a word to anyone, and the next morning, before sunrise, he walked into his barn. The old tractor sat in the corner exactly where it had been for years. Paint faded. Frame sejimstart. Engine quiet. Most people saw a relic. Daniel saw something else entirely. He pulled the tarp off slowly, as if uncovering something that deserved respect, ran his hand along the metal, and then he did something no one else in that county would have understood. He started taking it apart, not because it was broken, but because it wasn't finished. Days passed. Then weeks. After finishing his mail route each afternoon, Daniel would disappear into that barn until the light faded. Tools clinked. Metal shifted. Bolts loosened and tightened again. He adjusted the plow assembly first, not for speed, for depth. Then he moved to the weight distribution, adding pieces of scrap iron in places that didn't make sense unless you knew exactly what you were trying to achieve. And that was the part nobody knew, because buried in his father's notebook was something most men would have ignored: a series of measurements, angles, depths, pressure notes, repeated over and over again, as if Thomas Reeves had been chasing a very specific condition. Not just deeper plowing, but controlled disruption, a way to break through the hardened salt layer without destroying the structure beneath it. Daniel flipped through those pages late one night, stopping at a line his father had underlined twice. If you turn it too shallow, you spread the damage. If you turn it too deep, you bury what still lives. But if you find the line between, the soil resets itself. Daniel closed the notebook slowly, because that line, that invisible boundary, no one had ever proven it existed. And yet everything his father had done pointed to it. That was the secret. Not a miracle machine, not a shortcut, but a very precise understanding of where to cut and where to leave untouched. And the only tool capable of reaching that exact depth was sitting right in front of him, modified, tested, ignored by everyone else. Daniel stepped back from the tractor, wiping his hands, and for the first time in years, he turned the key. The engine coughed once, then again. Then it roared to life, not loudly, not impressively, but steadily. Like something that had been waiting. The next morning, a few farmers noticed something strange. Dust rising from the old Reeves land. "Someone's out there," one man said, squinting across the road, doing what another replied. "Looks like plowing." That got attention, because nobody plowed that land anymore, not after what it had become. By midday, a small group had gathered at the edge of the property. They stood with arms crossed, watching. Daniel moved slowly across the field, guiding the old tractor in straight, deliberate lines. No rushing, no wide turns. Every pass looked intentional. Richard Hale heard about it before the day was over. He didn't come immediately. He didn't need to. Men like Richard didn't react to small things. They waited until something became worth their time. And at first, this didn't. "Let him play," he said when one of his workers mentioned it. "That land'll teach him faster than I can." The laughter came easy, but something about the way Daniel worked started to unsettle people, because he wasn't guessing. He wasn't experimenting blindly. He was repeating something, following a pattern, and day after day, he came back. Before work, after work, weekends, always the same slow, steady motion. Always that same machine cutting into the ground deeper than anyone thought possible. The first week, nothing changed. The second week, the surface still looked lifeless. By the third week, the whispers started. You see those lines? Looks darker. Just under the top. No, that's just shadow. But it wasn't, and Daniel knew it. Because when he stepped down one evening and pressed his hand into the freshly turned strip, the soil felt different, softer, cooler, alive in a way the rest of the field wasn't. He didn't say anything. He just stood there for a moment longer than usual, because this was the part his father never reached. The moment where theory started to become proof. But this story wasn't really about that first sign of success. It was about what happened when other people started to notice. Because curiosity turns into pressure very quickly in a small town. And pressure reveals who truly understands what they're doing. By early June, more people were stopping by. Not to help, not to learn, but to watch. And among them one afternoon stood Richard Hale. He didn't say anything at first, just observed, arms folded, eyes narrow, watching that old tractor move across a piece of land he himself had dismissed without a second thought. Then finally he spoke. Still digging, he called out. Daniel stopped the tractor. The engine idled low. He turned slightly, just working the soil. Richard stepped forward a few paces, boots pressing into the edge of the field. "You're wasting your time," he said. "And your fuel." A pause. Then louder so the others could hear. "You can't fix land like this with scrap metal and stubbornness." A few men chuckled again. Familiar, comfortable. But Daniel didn't rise to it. He never did. Instead, he reached down, picked up a handful of freshly turned soil, and let it fall slowly through his fingers. Then he looked at Richard. "Depends how deep you're willing to go." The words hung in the air longer than expected, because they weren't defensive. They weren't angry. They were certain. And for the first time since the auction, Richard didn't laugh right away. Because somewhere beneath that quiet answer, there was something he couldn't quite dismiss. And what happened next was the part nobody in Greene County ever forgot. The summer of 2010 came in harder than anyone expected. By mid-June, the rain had stopped entirely. Not slowed, not scattered. Stopped. Day after day, the sky stretched empty and pale, the sun pressing down without mercy. The wind carried dust instead of moisture, and the soil across Greene County began to crack open, like old paint peeling off wood. At first, no one panicked. Farmers had seen dry seasons before. That was part of the cycle. But by early July, something felt different. The irrigation systems started running longer hours. Pumps strained. Water levels dropped faster than forecasts predicted. And still, no rain. Richard Hale stood at the edge of his largest field. One morning, hands on his hips, staring across rows that should have been thick and green. Instead, they looked tired. His crops weren't dead, not yet, but they were struggling. Leaves curled inward. Growth slowed. And every day without rain pushed the margin closer to failure. "Run the south irrigation line longer," he told one of his men. "We'll compensate." They did, for a while. But systems built on abundance don't hold well under scarcity. By late July, even Richard's land, the most advanced, the most funded, began to show signs of stress. And that was when someone said it. "You should go look at Reeves' place." Richard didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to, because in his mind, there was nothing to see. A failed experiment on a dead field, but the man didn't back down. "I'm telling you, it's not the same out there." That was enough. Richard drove out that afternoon. The road to Daniel's land hadn't changed. Still quiet. Still overlooked. But the moment he stepped out of his truck, something felt wrong. Or rather, something didn't match. Because where every other field in Greene County showed strain, this one didn't. Not entirely. It wasn't perfect, but it was holding. Patches of green cut through the land in long, deliberate lines. The soil between them looked darker, denser, as if it had kept something the others had lost. Richard walked forward slowly, boots pressing into ground that didn't crumble the way he expected. He crouched, picked up a handful of soil, paused, because it wasn't dry. Not deep down. Moisture still clung beneath the surface. Not much, but enough. And that was all it took. A sound broke the silence behind him, the low, steady rumble of an engine. Richard turned. Daniel's tractor moved across the field in another slow pass, the same way it had for weeks. No rush, no adjustment, just that same controlled motion. Richard stood there longer than he meant to, watching, because this didn't make sense. Not with everything he knew, not with everything he had invested. And that was the moment something shifted, not in the field, but in him. Daniel stopped the tractor near the edge and cut the engine. The sudden quiet made the air feel heavier. Richard stepped forward. No smile this time. No audience to perform for. Just two men standing in the middle of something neither of them could ignore anymore. How Richard asked. It wasn't loud. It wasn't demanding. It was honest. Daniel wiped his hand slowly on a cloth, then looked out across the field before answering. It was never about adding more water, he said. Richard frowned slightly. Then what? Daniel bent down, pressed his fingers into the soil, and pulled up a small clump. The water was always there, he said. Just couldn't reach where it needed to go. Richard didn't speak, because he understood enough to know what that meant. And you think, that old machine did this? Daniel shook his head once. No, he said. The machine just followed the right line. A pause. Then what it? My father found it. That was the part Richard hadn't expected, because suddenly, this wasn't just about a man and a field. It was about time. About something that had started long before this drought. Long before that auction. Long before anyone laughed. Richard looked out across the land again, and for the first time, he saw it differently. Not as a failure, not as a gamble, but as something he had missed. And what happened next was the part nobody talked about openly, because pride doesn't fall all at once. It cracks, quietly. I've got fields twice this size drying out right now, Richard said after a long silence. Daniel didn't respond. You're telling me you can fix that? Another pause. Daniel stood up straight. No, he said. Richard looked at him sharply. I can't fix it. Daniel continued. Not like this. The words hung there, clear, uncomfortable, but I can show you where to start. That was it. No offer, no condition, no trace of the humiliation that had come before. Just truth, and that made it heavier than any argument. Richard exhaled slowly, because in that moment he understood something he hadn't before. This wasn't a competition anymore. It never really was. It was a difference in understanding, and one of them had been wrong. Word spread quickly after that day, not because Daniel told anyone. He didn't, but because people saw. They saw which fields survived the worst stretch of drought Greene County had faced in years. They saw where the soil held, and where it failed. And slowly, the laughter disappeared. Not all at once, but piece by piece, replaced by something quieter. Respect. By the next season, a few smaller farmers approached Daniel, carefully, not wanting to seem desperate, but not willing to ignore what they had witnessed either. Daniel helped where he could, not by doing the work for them, but by showing them what to look for, what to listen to, and more importantly, what not to disturb. Richard Hale changed too, not publicly, not in ways most people would notice, but he stopped expanding, stopped chasing more land just because he could, and for the first time in decades, he started walking his fields again, not riding over them, walking, feeling the soil under his boots, because once you realize you've misunderstood something fundamental, you don't forget it. Years passed. The Reeves land never became the biggest farm in Greene County. It never needed to. It became something else, something steadier, reliable in ways weren't. Daniel kept his job as a mailman, drove the same routes, waved to the same people, and every afternoon he returned to that field. Not to prove anything anymore, just to tend to it. The old tractor stayed, still running, still carving those same careful lines into the earth, because it was never about replacing it. It had already done what it was meant to do. And maybe that's the part most people missed, because this story was never really about a mailman becoming a farmer. And it wasn't about proving rich men wrong. It was about something much quieter than that, something easier to overlook, the kind of knowledge that doesn't shout, that doesn't advertise itself, that doesn't change just because people laugh at it. Because the truth is, the land doesn't care how much money you have. It doesn't care how new your machines are. It doesn't care how many people agree with you. It responds to one thing, understanding. And that's something you can't buy. You can't rush. You can't fake. Daniel Reeves never argued with the men who mocked him, never tried to convince them, because he didn't need to. He just listened longer, worked quieter, and trusted something they couldn't see yet. So the next time you find yourself laughing at something that looks outdated, or someone who doesn't fit the picture you expect, you might want to stop, just for a moment, and ask yourself one question. What if they understand something you don't? Because sometimes, the difference between failure and survival is just knowing how deep to go and having the patience to get there.